Welcome everybody. I appreciate you taking some time in the afternoon. This is the hardest time slot to speak at RSA because you've already had several days of hopefully amazing sessions, but you probably all ate lunch in the last 2 hours and food coma is about to set in. So this will be entertaining. Important thing for me to remind everybody is that the words that I say are not those of RSA. So if you don't like what I say, please don't blame RSA, but feel free to tell them that, God, Andy is an awful speaker. They're also not the words of any of the employers that I interact with. My name, by the way, is Andy Ellis. I spent 20 years as Akamai's Chief Security Officer, and now I wander around and pundit and say all the things I couldn't say when I was a Chief Security Officer, and hopefully that wisdom is helpful for you. So we're going to start with audience participation. I'm going to play a little hypothetical game. I was going to do this for real, but the lawyers were like, you cannot gamble in California. They won't prosecute shoplifters, but they will totally prosecute you for gambling. Here's the hypothetical. You're going to get to play a game exactly once. And the way this game works is you bet some amount of money, you pick a number from 1 to 20, I roll a 20-sided die. If you guessed wrong, I keep your money. Go me. If you guess right, you get back your money and 20 times whatever you wagered. So for those of you who've done probability, you know that your expected payout is 1.05. You make 5% if you get to play this game forever. This is a great game. This is basically what venture capital is like, which is where I spend some of my time, is you make enough small bets, it pays out. So everybody raise your hands. I'm not even going to ask a question. So I want everybody to raise their hands. Now I'm going to ask you questions, and when the answer becomes no, put your hand down. Look at that smug. Come on, hand up. There we go. Okay, so first of all, would you bet with $1? You only get to play once. Somebody doesn't even want to play for $1. It's like, not worth my time to even do this for $1 because I might get 20 bucks. What do I buy with 20 bucks? Okay. Would you bet $10? Come on, it's like bad Starbucks for 10 bucks. Okay, everybody's like, yeah, I would bet $10. How about $100? Yeah, that's generally where most people put their hands down. They're like, that is like more than my per diem. But he's like, dude, I can make $2,000. I'll just like not eat at McDonald's today, and like I'll charge my employer for the 100. Would you bet $1,000? Any hands still? Oh, still got a hand up. Okay. Oh, another one over there. How about $10,000? Anybody? Oh, still got one hand. 100,000? $1 million? I've only ever once gotten to $1 million and had somebody keep their hand up. Turns out he was a weapons buyer for the Army, and he's like, dude, $1 million isn't even a tank. Okay? But the reason that I go through that exercise, not just to make sure you're all awake and engaged, is to recognize that cost context matters, right? You value something by what you give up to get it. $10 is nothing if you're an RSA attendee. 100,000 is something. This is also important to remember when you think about the lottery. How many people have heard the phrase, the lottery is a tax on the mathematically illiterate, right? Bullshit. You know what the lottery is? It is the only way out of poverty for some people. A marginal dollar is not going to do anything for them, given all of the various economic incentives. I do not have enough time to explain them all for you, but the lottery ticket is a way out. It's not a tax on them for being illiterate, it's a tax on them for being below the poverty line. The context of the decisions that people make is critical to those decisions. And so when we try to reduce it just to math, we sometimes ignore that important part of the human element. But we're here today to talk about risks. The important thing when we talk about risk management is to talk about what are risks. Like, what is a risk? I always love this. Like, give me a risk. And the challenge with risks is they can be a lot of different things that don't look like each other. So one thing that can be a risk is a hazard. And think of a hazard as an individual element that makes the world more unsafe, and it almost always starts with a mismatched expectation. Imagine you're going to build a product, right? And a product development lifecycle looks something like this. You have a customer need, you create a product goal, then you design your product, then you build your product, then you implement the product, and then you use the product. And if you have a mismatched expectation between the product you wanted to build and what the customer is going to use it for, we call this misuse. I build a web server, very minimalist, lightweight, just for delivering static files off of a system so that I can run it on a Raspberry Pi. And somebody with a heart monitor puts it onto the heart monitor to deliver stats about it. That is misuse. This is not what I built my web server for. And so you're going to have a set of hazards because what you're using it for don't match the goals of my product. If there's a defect between my goals and my design, that's an architectural defect. Think about protocol flaws, right? The goal of SSL is to ensure secure communications between two locations, and like every version of the protocol had a flaw in it because our goal was not met by our design. Sometimes it's because we don't know enough when we're doing our design. Between design and engineering, this is where vulnerabilities show up. We got the design right, but what we actually built doesn't work. Has some negative outcomes when you tickle it in certain ways. Most of the time, people are talking about vulnerabilities. But sometimes it's a misconfiguration. We have a product, it could work. It's not secure by default because then it wouldn't work at all when you first turned it on, so we make it do everything, and then it's like, oh, once I figure out what I don't want it to do, take out those capabilities. But nobody ever does that, so misconfigurations. And then sometimes we actually configure it correctly, but our processes around using it don't actually work. And so, yes, we can totally deprovision our users when they're terminated, but we don't have a process that actually makes sure we do it. So our implementation might work, but our operation doesn't. Each of these is a type of hazard. Very hard to compare between a process flaw and a misuse of a product. So really important that we sort of mind the gap. But this is just hazards. Hazards are not the only type of things that we talk about when we say risk. Sometimes we talk about losses. Right? And a loss might just be an incident. This is actually funny to me. Most of the time, the worst loss that happens to your company is not the direct loss from a breach. It's the incident cost of the breach. I have to go run this incident. I have to pay fines to somebody. It is not that losing data records cost me money. No, I had to pay California fines because I lost records. Incidents are bad outcomes. Why do you think people don't want to talk about incidents? Because when they talk about them, they become more expensive. So that's a loss. That's a risk you could incur. It could just be the standard CIA failure, breach of confidentiality, breach of integrity, breach of availability. But most of the times, those themselves are not direct losses. Those just lead to one. And of course, sometimes you do actually just have, what is the poor outcome? A plane crashed. Poor outcome. Right? Entire industries talk about the concept of unacceptable losses as a way to quantify sort of a risk. What's the harm? Maybe you can put a dollar number on it, maybe you can't, but sometimes this is what we talk about as a risk. In rolling that die, your unacceptable loss was the number didn't come up the way you wanted it, and you lose your dollar or your $1,000 or your $10,000, right? And boom, that's your unacceptable loss. If it was truly unacceptable, you're not going to play the game with me, is the reality in that case. Now, not always just losses. We can also have, there's always the fun, risk of the button not doing what you want it to do. Okay, well, I will start clicking while we figure out what's wrong with the button there. We could talk about adversaries, right? People love to talk about adversaries as risks. Like adversaries are only risks when they do something to you, but maybe it's your competitors and they're doing economic espionage against you. Very, very rare in the United States. Just to be very clear, we've only ever prosecuted 6 people in this country for economic espionage because it's so rare. Because usually, somebody wants to commit it and they take something over to your competitor and they're like, hey, I have the secret designs, and you know what your competitor does? They pick up the phone and they call the FBI. They're like, I am falling for that trap. That would not be a good day for me. Could be insiders, could be nation states. Auditors should actually be on your list of some of the most dangerous adversaries that your companies face. Right? Because an auditor failing you on an audit that you publicly talk about is probably the worst outcome that could happen to you. Unacceptable loss is someone says you are no longer SOC 2 certified or no longer PCI DSS compliant. That is worse to you than a minor thing like a data breach. So we think about these as threat actors, or again, a risk. Then, of course, environment. A lot of times we like to talk about the environment. We have some collection of assets or systems or organizations we want to compare. I've got an engineering team over here and an engineering team over here. Which is riskier? I have an employee here, and they might be risky, and we think about them as an environment. Or maybe I have some processes. And so when we think about environments, people often want to score them. There's a whole bunch of vendors downstairs that are all about third-party risk management. What are they trying to do? They're trying to measure the risk of a third party, an entire company, and all of their asset systems organizations, right? That's vendor management. So here's where we're sort of thinking about aggregations and clusters are also things we talk about as risks. So we have these like 4 categories that you put them together and you have to connect them in some way. Like an adversary is not a risk, a hazard is not a risk, a scenario, a story, a fairy tale, if you will. That I say, I have this adversary. This adversary exploits a hazard or set of hazards to induce a loss in my environment, right? Little Red Riding Hood, right? Big bad wolf, social engineers, and eats, right? Boom, right there. There is your scenario. That's interesting. I'm exposed to social engineering, very hard for somebody to sort of wrap their head around. So when we're talking about scenarios and all of these risks, single biggest failure in the information security community is we think when we say a risk, whoever we're listening to is thinking the same thing. Really important to recognize that language matters. Make sure that if you're talking about a scenario, so is the other person. Or if you're talking about a hazard, so is the other person. Because if you're talking about hazards and they're thinking about losses, this conversation is not going to be productive. So here's your first thing is a risk is not well defined. But we're here to talk about risk measurement, or why you can't. But why do we want to measure risk? I posit there are 3 reasons why we try to measure risk. We want to communicate risk. We want to communicate some shared understanding of the world, the dangers that apply to us. We want to change the world. So I want to scare you, and because you're scared, you'll do something different about it. Or we want to compare. It's a subset sort of communication, which is, hey, we're doing this thing and our competitor is better than we are. We should up our game. Or what we are doing is the exact same thing as what SolarWinds was doing the day before they got breached. I want to compare myself to a bad outcome. Right? So in a way, we're trying to then force change through comparison. Lots of people want to measure risk, right? Everybody from the CISO at the center who has to report up to their board, who has to deal with security vendors outside their business, who's going to have a vulnerability manager, a third-party risk manager, a whatever manager, right? We've got 50 people who work for us who all need to talk about risk. And then we have people like me, not a CISO anymore. I'm an academic. I get to hang out here and talk about risk. You can go downstairs and go to the FAIR Institute's booth with a bunch of academics who want to measure risk for you. So first thing I'm going to tell you is that these groups mostly do, in fact, line up to my categories, which is the board mostly just wants to compare. Am I better or worse than expectation? And if I'm worse than expectation, do something about it. And if I'm not, I don't care. The CISO is trying to communicate, so are the academics and evangelists. I mean, we would like you to change and do what we do, but that just makes us feel good. Security vendors would like you to change. They would like you to change to giving them more money. But your vulnerability manager, all of your operational managers in security are trying to change the state of the business, and they believe that the more you can measure risk, the more change you will have. Not actually really directly related. You have to understand how humans react to learning about risk. But let's ignore those of us who are academics and evangelists for the moment, kick us off the list. Right, here's our groups of people. And then let's just look inside the security team and say, what are they really trying to do? Right? We want to change the world, so we find about a risk. We're going to do something with this risk. And it's a little bit of compare, communicate, and change. And so let's look at the process that we're going to use once we might have theoretically measured a risk. Risk identification and triage. I learn about a risk. I decide what I'm going to do with it. Hopefully we make the world better because we now have done that. And that process probably looks something like this in all of your organizations. You might have a 6-step process or a 3-step process, but you discover a risk. You learn about something new. You evaluate it. Big thing here is scoring it. How bad is this risk? You prioritize it against all the other work, and then you execute on mitigating the risk, or you throw the risk away is often what happens. Now, if you look at this process, what really happens is the first thing that comes in is if you look at a risk and it is so blatantly and obviously bad, right? It's an actual scenario that has already instantiated a loss. You do not do the rest of this process. You declare an incident and you go fix it. And you implicitly will do some evaluation, prioritization, execution, but it's done fast, in real time. It is not going to follow the same process. But most risks don't look like that, so instead they get farmed out to some risk manager. Some companies, that's a spreadsheet where they're going to track risks, or it's in Jira, or it's change requests. And that risk manager has to sort of drive it through the prioritization process. And the rest of your organization is incentivized to make sure that the risk manager does the best possible job they can, which sounds very backwards, doesn't it? Like, how often do you say, I want you to be perfect at your job before I do my job? Why? Because the more work I can make the risk manager do, the longer I can defer fixing anything. You want to take 5 years measuring a risk? Go for it. The incentives are totally lined up. You have 20 things you want me to fix. Can you perfectly prioritize those? Number one has to be more important than everything else, and I won't start work on any of them until you've prioritized all 20. Like, this is what often happens. Now, some of these risks sort of get farmed out. We call them routine risks, right? The things we get lots of. We've run a vulnerability scan. We've got 1,000 hygiene problems that we have to fix. We also have severe vulnerabilities, like the really big problems. They sound really scary, but they're not obvious how to exploit them. And these often get farmed out into multiple different processes. Routine risks get put on a risk register, get filed as change requests with engineering. We're like, please, will you fix this? It's okay. And the CISO cannot have any time focused on anything in this category, right? There's thousands of things here. None of them are that bad. Maybe the aggregation is bad. That might be a severe vulnerability in itself, that you don't patch anything. But no one vulnerability is that bad. Severe vulnerabilities often fall into two categories. There's the executive hazards. Because we exist, we have this hazard, this vulnerability, and we have no intention of fixing it. How many of you work for companies that have large data stores of PII? Oh, come on, a lot of hands, right? How many of you could get rid of all of the PII in your company and still exist as a company? Right? That is an we gotta talk later. But that's an executive hazard. Like, you have chosen to have a lot of data in your company. That's a big potential loss. We'd like you to secure it, but the security choices do not include get rid of the data. Executive hazards. Others are hard. So the CISO has to get involved. We've got to trade off. We've got to convince people that the protections around that PII are not nearly where they ought to be. But it's arcane, it's difficult, it's really improbable events, and there's an art form to telling those stories. So when we think about all of these processes that we just put together, right, we can sort of collect them here and say, like, our incident process, like, that's really easy. We have incidents. We have things that are hygiene, like, just please brush your teeth every night and patch. Right? We don't want to have to convince you to brush your teeth every single day and explain why you should brush your teeth and why you should floss your teeth. Like, once we've established that that's good hygiene, please just do it. But there are programs, and these are the hard things. And so what happens is we're trying to measure each of these things that feel fundamentally different and often use sort of the same measurements and the same styles. So we get into this, like, how are we going to measure these things? And what's convenient is those sort of showed up in this nice place. And so the first thing we do is we do the 9-box. Almost everybody starts doing 9-box evaluation, which is you say, what is the damage, high, medium, or low? What is the likelihood, high, medium, or low? And you prioritize based on this. And the reality is, if it's high, it's an incident. Like, this is bad. It's already happening to us. Let's go fix it right now. Hygiene. Not really, it's high likelihood that it will happen, but it's not going to hurt us that much. Somebody exploits a vulnerability that lets them do nothing, it's still annoying. They run a crypto miner on a web server we don't care about. At least we hope all they're doing is running the crypto miner and they're not leaving it behind to hide whatever they really did. But that's hygiene. Low, high, programs. Things that we need to fix because they're existential, but maybe it won't happen for 10 years. Very different problems we're trying to measure. And then, of course, we do have this box over here at the bottom, which is the litter. This is not going to hurt us very much, and it's not likely to happen. But you probably want to pick up the litter when you're walking around. Maybe you're not going to invest in a pure litter cleanup, but you'd like to do something about this. But the real challenge that we have here is this is a 5-box. There are 4 different processes here, and then everything in the middle does not fit into one of those processes. And almost every fight we have is because we don't have things to fit in the middle. Right? How do you deal with something that's not quite an incident but not quite hygiene? Right? Worse than hygiene but not an incident. Or more likely than a program would fix but not quite so bad as being an incident. So we try to get a little more precise. We say, well, what does medium really mean? Right? So maybe we implement the 25 box. And we say, oh, I got medium high and medium low now. But the challenge here is we don't have another process. So what happens is this just becomes, we say, oh, well, obviously if you're in these bottom corners here, right, we're back to a 5 box, except now we have this struggle of like, God, this high / medium high, is that really an incident? We actually sort of made our life a little harder here. And so at some point we're like, screw it, we'll just pretend everything's an incident. Like just like we have grade inflation, we'll have incident inflation. We'll have more of them, we're back to having our lovely 5 box. And so that's basically the state of art for qualitative risk management, looks something like this. And when I was at Akamai, we had what we called the pyramid of pain. I did use that name before everybody else started using it to mean something entirely different, so I'm sort of screwed though, because there's one of me and like 1,000 people using it. That basically just rotated this on its side. We said, let's talk about likelihood, let's talk about how bad it could be. Except the difference was, we went here and we actually said, our badness rating is the severity of the incident that we will declare. Right? We already have a badness rating. I don't have to say high, medium, or low. I have to say we have defined a Sev 1 incident is a breach that looks like this. Therefore, I have a scenario as a Sev 1 incident. Risk, likelihood is hard. We can't put numbers on it. So we'll talk about who would be surprised. Right? Either it's repeating, it's already happening to us. It's plausible. Nobody in the company would be surprised if this happens. In fact, most people are already surprised it's not happening. Mildly surprising is the gullible people get surprised. We have employ naive people. We call them product managers. Their job is to believe nothing will ever go wrong. It's great having them because they're the ones responsible for finding ways to fleece everybody else out of money. Very naive, wonderful. But when they get, like they're not surprised, but everybody else would be, okay, we'll call that mildly surprising. The bottom, very surprising, like I have paranoid security researchers. If they're like, I don't see any way this happens, okay, great, very surprising. Anything else, just surprising. Now what's really nice about doing something like this is we discovered that any hazard has a lot of different scenarios. And often a hazard that had a surprise and it's like a repeating severity 2 incident, we can tell ourselves a story that's a plausible severity 1. And in fact, we can tell ourselves a mildly surprising story that turns it into a disaster. But all of those are just tier 2s. Every scenario is going to land, every hazard will have multiple scenarios land in different spots. What we discovered here is that the company did not tolerate tier 0 and tier 1 hazards. The moment you found one, incident, let's fix it. Oh, by the way, disaster was our retroactive category for, we called it a Sev 1 at the time, but the business that existed after the incident was not the business that existed before it. It was actually an existential problem. We implemented changes across the entire business to prevent that from ever happening again. That's a disaster. So, programs were the things that were mostly the left side of tier 3 and below, hygiene, right side of tier 3 and below. But our problem was we still had this tier 2 in the middle that was still really hard. How do you score this? And we'd have like dozens of hazards in this category. And getting people to prioritize them would be challenging. They would come to us and they'd say, well, is this one more important than that one? Now here's where I'm going to pause for a moment and say, it doesn't matter. How many of you work in a company that only has one interesting security problem to fix? Right? How many of you work in companies that have more interesting problems to fix than your company has bandwidth to fix them? Okay? That's all, pretty much all of you, which means you don't care which one gets fixed. Please just go fix one. So if you've got 8 things that you're like, these are all tier 2 hazards, take them to whoever owns them and say, which one do you think is the worst and the easiest one to fix? Prioritize by most likely to get done. Most important thing. You can ignore the rest of this talk and go execute that and you will win because you will get good work done. And when they fix that problem, buy them a cake in front of the CEO. Because you know what will happen? Every other team will say, how do I get cake in front of the CEO? You say, fix an interesting problem and I will buy you a cake. But let's talk about hygiene for a moment because this is where the most hazards show up. And so therefore it's where we do most of our risk measurement. Probably the most common risk measurement algorithm that people are familiar with in hygiene is CVSS. Now I know CVSS is on 4.0. But I'm going to use CVSS 2.0 because it's actually easier to understand than 4.0. And this is how you do a CVS 2.0 calculation. which is you start by saying, here is the vulnerability, what is its exploitability? Not to be confused with exploitability that will show up again in a moment. This is the access vector, whether it's a local or network, authentication, access complexity. You will end up with a score when you multiply these together between 1.24 and 9.9. We couldn't quite get to 10, but that's okay because we're going to normalize later. This gives you the exploitability rating. You can think of this as a proxy for probability. Then we figure out the damage. What's the impact? Impact to confidentiality, to integrity, to availability. And we're going to calculate those. And there's a modification where you can change the weightings for these three to make it even more complicated. And you're going to get an impact number that does not have any scores below 2.8 except for 0. This has no impact to me. And we're going to combine these two to get base. And CVSS, in the most deranged mathematical choice I could possibly point out, of which CVSS has made a lot of them, it adds probability to damage. It does not multiply them together. Very strange that you sort of end up with this, like, if it's this likely, you can get up to 6 points, or 0.6 points out of likelihood and 4 points out of impact, and then we're going to cut down a little bit out of that one. Now, by the way, this is what's known as a Fermi calculation for Fermi problems. And Fermi problems, or Fermi approaches to problems, is where you say, I have no clue what the answer is, but I will make a sufficiently complex equation for it, and I will guess at all of the elements of the complex equation, and my guesses should average out in how they are wrong. The classic example for this is, how long does it take a bowling ball to hit the bottom of the Marianas Trench if you drop it from a cruise liner overhead? Almost nobody knows the actual answer, but you can say, oh, I can create an equation for the terminal velocity and do all of these things, and I can calculate it. And the real answer is, you have 20 people calculate it, you throw out the high and the low answer, take the average, it's actually pretty good, because it turns out that humans as a group are great at Fermi approaches. Individual humans actually just suck at this, so be very careful about doing it. But this gives you the base score for CVSS 2.0. Then we add in to get to the temporal score, which is basically all about, like, is this just we've found the vulnerability, or is there an exploit, or is it patched? And in the second most deranged choice made by CVSS, as we're calculating this, is if you have an official remediation that you have not implemented, the score goes down. You have that right. If there's a vulnerability, whether or not it's being exploited in the wild, with no patch, you are worse off than if there is a patch but you haven't bothered using it. Like, this is really weird. It could be that I'm like, CVSS 7 is my threshold for, like, I gotta patch it. There's no patch available. I'm a 7.1, so, like, what do? Patch becomes available. I'm a 6.8. Guess I don't have to patch it right now. My SLA got better. Like, WTF, CVSS. And just to be clear, I was the first consumer of CVSS using it when it was 1.0 all the way through my tenure at Akamai. Then we add some more because we want to add back in damage again. Notice we did probability, damage, probability, now we're going to do damage again. We've got to add all of these in. And the way to think about what you're doing here is you're basically taking whatever your CVSS score is, and up to 50% of the distance to 10 you can add back in with damage. So something that had a score of 0, you can get up to a 5 if somehow the 0 could end your business. But if it's already a 10 but couldn't actually hurt you, it's just going to stay at 10. Very strange, and it turns out there's a lot of different combinations. If you just take these without rebalancing confidentiality, integrity, and availability, there are 700,000 possibilities, 45 million if we customize them. This is really challenging. Like, I just got to watch Tom Brady get roasted, so you get to see a Tom Brady slide. Also, because Dennis Fisher is in the room, you get a Tom Brady slide. But this is like being an NFL quarterback, like trying to figure out what is happening on the field. There's so many things that can happen. But at the end of the day, are there really? Sure, there's lots of these choices. 15 years of data of CVSS, there were about 30 different scores ever. I went through, I think it was 28 scores that we used. And then there's this long tail of scores that appeared once or twice. In every single one of them, I could easily see how the person had made a mistake in scoring. It should have been scored as one of those 28. The value of CVSS was that if I gave you a score off of a 9 box, and you're not a risk manager, you feel entitled to argue with, well, why is this a medium high? Should this be a high high or vice versa? We will argue. If I say this is a 7.22, and you have not spent time looking at CVSS at all, you're like, ooh, there was math. This is amazing. And I kid you not, like people stopped arguing about patching because we gave them numbers. That was its value. It did not matter how accurate the number was, as long as to their gut it was sort of in the right area. Now, how many people here have a CISSP? Awesome, a lot of people. You didn't think you'd get asked that. You think risk measurement should be easy. We all did this, hopefully. I think CISSP still does risk calculations. So we take this actuarial model where we say, what is the loss? What is the probability of the loss? I gave you easy numbers here. So we get annualized loss expectancy like this. These two things is a $500,000 loss. $5 million, 10% a year. We're going to ignore things like discounting over the future and net present value, which we should absolutely worry about, but we're going to ignore it for here. Then we want to buy some solution. So there's some cost to buy and do integration. Maybe that's $50,000. Our maintenance or subscription cost is $14,000. Our reduction in events, as promised by the vendor, is going to be 10%. We should pause right here because we have something that is only going to happen every 10 years, and we're claiming that it will drop by 10%. Which went from one every 10 years to one every 11 years. I defy anyone to know that those numbers are accurate unless they're the person committing the crime and just saying, oh, look, if you buy this, I promise I'll delay by a year. But we can do the math. Our cost to support this is $26,000 a year. We're going to leave out your cost, your time and energy in actually supporting the solution. We get risk reduction, also doing that math, of $28,000 or $50,000 a year, which gives us saving of $24,000 a year. We put these numbers in front of the CFO. They give us budget approval. This is great. We have positive return on security investments. We want to buy the next solution. And look at that. It's a $5 billion risk. End our company, but it's only going to happen one in every 10,000 years. 0.01% risk. But it has the exact same annualized loss expectancy. So we can buy the same solution, and we get the same benefit, and we get to go home. You can't actually do this. These numbers are BS. The sensitivity analysis of getting something wrong when it is that rare is massive. If it's not 0.01%, put 0.001%, and I defy you to prove to me that there's a difference between those two that you could find in any scenario, you would never buy this. So this is a challenge, and the reality is this draws from this idea of actuarial risk management. We have data. How many people work in insurance here, right? Talk to your insurance folks. Like, they have tons of data, but they're not trying to measure the risk that your car will be stolen if you buy car insurance. They don't care about your car at all. And it's not because they're blood-sucking capitalists. They don't care about your car because they want to insure every car in this room, and their data tells them how many of those cars will be stolen next year. You can't apply that to an individual to think about risk. So when you think about actuarial models for risk measurement, you are not measuring risk, you are measuring expectation, and not probabilistic expectation. You are actually measuring an expense that you know you're going to have. Your risk is that you measured incorrectly and you guessed incorrectly, and you gave everybody ransomware insurance because nobody ever made a ransomware claim. And then the year that everybody made a ransomware claim, you all lost a lot of money paying out ransomware claims because your actual data did not match reality because reality changed. That's a big challenge that you have when you deal with models like this. You're not measuring reality, you're measuring history. So then we come to FAIR, the FAIR model, which basically is this giant Fermi calculation that's going to reduce to trying to turn the 9 box into this wonderful graduated box. So we're going to measure damage in dollars. Right? We're still being really high, medium, low, but we want dollars for this. And for frequency, the loss event frequency. How often will this happen every year? And so we think, okay, we've got this slider on the side, and it's going to go from 0 to $1 billion. I'll assume you're a $1 billion business. Feel free to renormalize this if you're a $12 billion business. And loss event frequency, we think of this. And we go, 0 to maybe 1,000 times a year. Right? 3 times a day, somebody is stealing from me. If you're in retail, it's a lot higher than that, but let's pretend for a moment. But the reality is that the difference between a 1,000 event and a 500 event is not that big. It sounds big to us, but most of the time we're going to deal with things pretty close to 0. So we actually have to make this a logarithmic scale, which makes it really hard to look at. And we say, okay, we have some events that are going to be up here in that corner, right? Happens all the time. That might be the dangerous thing. Happening all the time, our business is out. Those would be easy to prioritize. That's an incident somewhere up there. But the reality is, a lot of the times, here's where we're stuck. This is a hurtful event. It's not going to destroy the business, but it doesn't have zero cost. But we don't know what its frequency is. Maybe it's a 0.1, maybe it's a 0.01, maybe it's going to happen once a year. We don't know. And so this is where we spend most of our time trying to figure out like what that number might be. Now, when it's really easy, we instead get to pop up with something which, there we go, sits up in this upper corner where happening all the time, not very big, actuarial data is fantastic. If you have to deal with fraud, like shoplifting, you just say, oh, look, it's happening 20 times a day. It's costing me $50 every time it happens. And let's go try a solution. If I get from 20 times a day to 5 times a day, that's a win. I saved, what, $750 a day. I hope this service didn't cost me more than that, right? That's up there. This is fine for that, but you don't need to do complex calculations. You just collect data, right? Or we're back over here, and we're trying to do Fermi analysis to figure out if a 0.001 event is really a 0.01 event. Right? At the end of the day, you are making up these numbers. You do not have any data that says this is a 1 in 100,000 year event. Because if you did, if your company has a 1 in 100,000 year event, what should you do? An insurance plan. You shouldn't even bother that. You should ignore it. You don't care. None of your companies are planning to be around in 100,000 years, right? This is not what we're really worrying about. Because the challenge is events down here are really unique. You have to like draw this like weird story. Like we have built the coolest weapon ever, the Death Star. It has this hazard. There's this like exhaust port that leads directly to the reactor, and it's possible that somebody could like drop a torpedo in it. But you can't use AI assistant. There's no AI good enough to make that shot. In fact, humans can't make that shot. Wizards can make that shot. Like, I gotta have a wizard who is so in tune with the Force that they're the most powerful Force wielder we have ever seen, and they're an amazing pilot, too. It would be so cool if we had somebody doing that. Oh, wait, his name's Anakin Skywalker, and he's the guy who runs the Death Star. We don't have to worry about this problem. Oh, shit, he had a kid. Oops. Like, the Death Star's risk management was fine. Maybe Vader should have thought about prophylactics instead. Like, but you can't use this as an example of like, this is not good risk management. This was an ignorable event. Now, after it happens the first time, maybe you should think carefully about the second time because the world has changed. Think about the second Death Star you build. So now, the big challenge is even if we were able to score and measure our risks, our scenarios, and we have these numbers, and they can be useful. This is a 7.62, this is a 5.48, please work on the 7.62 first. Like, that's okay, especially if you don't say the 7.62 is definitely 7.62, not a 7.63 at all, right? But what happens when we try to take all of these risks that we've talked about and aggregate them and put them together to talk about risk in general as a collection of risks? Now what do we have? So let's just imagine, as a reminder, this is how these words all go together. Scenarios are adversaries exploiting hazards to get to losses in some environment. And so I have this scenario, and I give it a score. Let's give it a $44 million score. Let's be daring. Be like, I'm going to go in front of the CFO and say, we found a risk. It's a $44 million risk. I need to go deploy a defense. Give me $20 million in budget. I've just saved you $24 million. Aren't I awesome? Except what happens when, after looking at that scenario for a little while, you find right nearby it, same loss, there's another hazard. Oh, you could get in this other way instead, and it might be a slightly different adversary. It's a slightly different scenario, and this is a $40 million risk. As a company, do I have an $84 million risk? Do I have a $44 million risk? Do I have something between those two? I'm pretty sure I don't now have less than 44 million. That would be very weird if I had a 44 million. I added something and I got better, but who knows? Or maybe I did. Maybe it's slightly more likely that the $40 million risk gets hit first, cause us to shore up our defenses, thus preventing the $44 million risk. Maybe I'm really a $42 million risk. Maybe I can average all of my risks together. Almost everybody I've seen doing risk scoring and risk measurement doesn't think really clearly about the how you're going to aggregate these. And then maybe I have the same adversary, but I have a longer chain, like multiple hazards that are going to go into this. So what you have to think about when you're looking at any risk measure or risk approximation is what happens when you add more risk vectors. How is that really going to change your perceived risk? Right? And here's a simple way to look at it. Imagine that you have two companies, right? And these two companies, whatever your risk measurement is, I'm not going to laugh at it yet, comes out the same. Their risk score is both Y, and one buys the other, or they merge. Is the risk of this new company Y, or is it 2Y? Or is it something else? And once you've answered that in your head, you're wrong. Whatever answer you have, you're probably wrong, because now you can consider, what if you had company C with risk score Y, and it doubled its size in terms of number of assets, but all of the assets it added were perfectly managed with zero risk? Does your net risk score for your company go up, go down, stay the same? Right? Because if you said this is now 2Y, then you would have to accept that if I add it double the size and it's zero, my risk stays the same. But if you said this was Y, then I half my risk by adding safe systems. I don't have to fix anything. I just keep adding more stuff and have it be, totally fine. Like, you get into challenges here, right? Because we often don't really understand how we're putting these together. But our real goal is not to measure risk. Right? No company, except for people who are selling risk measurement services, actually cares about the score of a risk. What do they care about? Right? They care about changing and comparing. Risk measurement is just a communication skill to let us decide if we need to change, that's comparison, and then change. This is our goal. We should look at what's really happening here. And what's really happening here is that companies have perceived risk. So your vertical axis or perceived risk, things going up, and they think they're buying security value. Your salary is an investment in the creation of security value. And as the company goes along, perceived risks show up, and our expectation is that most of the time the value that we have already bought is suppressing those and keeping our perceived risks steady state. It's sort of like weight loss. You have a weight, and you eat a lot of food you probably shouldn't, but hopefully you're exercising, and so your weight kind of stays the same. Right? That's sort of how companies think about risk, right? They really sort of want to stay in one place, and the reality is humans love to be in the same spot of risk. The Peltzman effect talks about this, or risk homeostasis. If I take risk away from you, you will get more dangerous. Cars drive people drive cars way faster now than they did in the 70s. Why? Because we have safety features on the cars. It is safer to get into an accident at 70 miles an hour today than it was to get into an accident at 45 miles an hour 50 years ago. If you wanted people to drive safely, there's one technology that would cause people to drive amazingly safely, which is a spike in the middle of the steering wheel. Nobody will go above 5 miles an hour because the risk is really high, right? You've increased their risk perception, they're going to produce some value here. The challenge with this model, and why we want to communicate a lot about risk, is that if people do not see the risk, there's low perceived risk, well, if nothing's pushing up and I don't feel like our risk has changed, what does that mean? There's probably not much pushing down. So why am I spending so much money generating value that doesn't matter because I don't see any risk out there? So we want to talk about risk to justify our own jobs, which is a fascinating thing to think about. There's some of our motivations. And also, if it doesn't look like we're capable, if we do things in public that don't look like they reduce risk, then people think that the risk that's out there can't actually be that bad. Like if we're chasing people down, telling them to not click shit, rather than telling them, hey, we're going to improve the email infrastructure, they're like, why are you nagging me? Don't you have something better to do? And can I slash your budget while I'm at it? That's why we want to talk about risk, to keep from slashing our budgets. So when we talk about the value we produce, now we have new metrics we want to think about. We think about posture as a metric. How safe am I? We think about maturity as a metric. How safe will I be tomorrow? Do I have the processes to keep doing this? Well, on the bottom, we're often talking about scenarios and hazards and environments as sources of risk. I have a very dangerous engineering team with a very dangerous environment. They keep producing risk. Like, that's where we want to talk about environments here. And so when we think about posture and maturity as things we want to communicate, we should remember that posture, how we look exactly today, is the best we will ever look. It is the ceiling of our security value. Like, unless we change how we operate, we don't look better in the future. Maturity is our floor. It is how far we can fall once we stop looking. So if we have great processes, and that are almost as good as our posture, then great, I don't have to pay attention. I know that we'll stay at that posture. But if I don't have processes, and I as the CISO stop looking away from this, and I'm not asking people how well patched we are, why do I expect that they will keep patching things? They're like, oh, it's not a priority for the business. No C-level executive is talking about that, and there's no processes making sure I do this. Let's stop patching until someone pays attention. And when we talk about compliance or any form of reporting, just think of that as your footprint. This is the floor plan that when we talk about a ceiling and a floor, this is the limitation for us. This is how much it applies to. Oh, it only applies to our production infrastructure and not to anything else is a thing we have to understand when we think about compliance. So I went and took a look at some different ways people communicate, some references that are out there, and said, how do these map into this model? What are they actually talking about? So you can sort of have this for walking away. Here's a dashboard I pulled off of LinkedIn. And basically, it's a very busy one. Oh my goodness. It's talking about which environments we cover. It's a posture score. We are 95. I have no idea what 95 means. I think it's good, but I'm not positive. Our maturity is a perfect 4.0 across the board. It's a reference. Most people, when they do mock-ups, don't tweak their numbers. So this tells us, like, do we have processes for all of these? Nothing in this is trying to drive change. Nothing here is trying to compare. So it's clearly just a communication, and I would argue probably doesn't communicate very well, but it probably gets you out of the room because everybody's like, I don't even know how to ask a question about this, and they're going to wander away. I looked at the ESAF, the Executive Security Forum, and said, here's what they proposed. If you've never seen one of these heat maps, this is standard in the internal audit environments. They tend to use a heat map like this, and the way you read it is, in this case, their high is in the upper right, and every environment that's being rated shows up twice. There's a light blue circle, which is this is our inherent risk. If we did nothing, here's how bad it would be. And then it's connected to a dark blue circle that says after all of our cool controls, here's where our risk is. It's got this cool 25 box. And you'll notice we're very careful. Nothing is in the upper right corner with residual risk. But our most dangerous thing is the risk of software compromise. So it is trying to drive some change. We should focus on software compromise. It's trying to communicate, but it's all about posture. But they mix the areas here. Some of these are losses, some of these are scenarios. It's sort of weird and difficult to compare things like data loss to data theft to cyber extortion. Like these are all sort of being put in the same place. This is OWASP, has a reference for like, you should use this as a board deck. This is fantastic if you're a director of security talking to a CISO. If you're a CISO, I would not recommend putting this in front of the board, even though it feels like you really ought to be able to do so. It feels almost like a financial deck, right? It's got a bunch of hazards. It has controls that are kind of aligned to them, but I'm not a big fan of them, right? We have a goal, so we're trying to drive change. We're showing compliance against this goal. This is really sort of about communicating. And if your job is to drive one of these numbers up, then you should go to your boss and say, here's how I'm doing against driving those numbers up. Biggest challenge I have, you're reporting a number once a quarter. So if you're talking about a 30-day SLA, which is like the fourth line there, you don't have a 30-day SLA, you have a variable 89-day SLA. Because a vulnerability that shows up the day after you create the report, the person has 89 days to fix that before you are next going to report as to whether or not they have fixed things. These are point in time, not SLA measurements. NIST has the CSF. This is 2.0, which has governance, which is actually the only good thing to come out of CSF, except for the cyber defense matrix that Sunil, you put together. But the challenge that this one has, we're trying to compare the maturities in our environments, is if you look carefully at the bottom 5 maturity levels, does not talk about effectiveness. The NIST CSF talks about activity. Do I have a process that nominally addresses this thing, but it does not talk about whether that process actually mitigates any of our losses? So biggest challenge is, are these actually good, and are they honest? Because look, if your internal audit team is putting this together and they walk over to IT and they say, hey, tell me about all your bad processes, you have 2 possible responses. One is to be honest and deep and say, oh, let me show you everything bad, and you'll get a score of like 1.7. Or you can say, oh yeah, we've got a process to do that, and you kind of do. And you're like, oh look, we're like 4.5. And if you know they're going to go show this result to your C-level executives, you should not be fully honest with them. So as you walk away, just remember, lots of different goals, lots of different things we're measuring, some of which are risks and some of which are value, and we're trying to sort of do the same thing with them. But our goal is to really examine our measures, right? Think about what we're measuring. Think about what it costs you to measure, because that is a cost you're not spending to fix. Sometimes you have to. Play what if. If I measure it this way, what if the world changes like this? And that's what you want to understand, like, does this work for you? And then finally, just know your audience. Like, I think that measuring risk in dollars is stupid. But if you have a CFO that will give you money to fix things if you give them a dollar number, then give them a dollar number. Your job is not to tell the CFO that they're stupid. Like, it's my job to say that, but that's okay because I don't have a CFO. There's so much good work to do. Don't try to overfit on a great score. And listen for people who are using different language than you, especially if your job is to convince them to do something different. Now, I'm 40 seconds over, so there's no time for questions, but I'm about to wander over to the RSA bookstore to do a signing, so you're welcome to come find me there, but we're going to clear out the room. Is there actually another speaker after this? Oh, there's no other speakers after this, but well, we're going to clear out the room anyway. Thank you all.